everything last time. But that's okay, so long as we get the material, right? You know, we're not that behind. All right. So this is all stuff that is in your handouts from last week. So I didn't print out new handouts. I just consolidated it for today's purpose. But starting with mortality statistics, remember we had talked before, we were talking kind of about the math behind epidemiologic numbers. And so we talked about counts, which is literally the count of how many things that happen. And we talked about proportions and rates. Everything's ringing a bell to everybody. Well, we can also talk about all of these numbers in relation to mortality. So what's mortality? Anyone? Anyone?
Yeah. When someone dies.
Yes, mortality means they're dead, as opposed to morbidity, which just means they're sick, right? So why do we care about studying mortality at all, right? So if we study why people are dying, maybe then we can prevent people from dying. Probably not always. Eventually everyone's going to die, but for the most part, we want to prevent early deaths, usually, right? So when we study mortality, we're really talking about looking at the leading causes of death. So why are most people dying? 100 years ago, most people were dying from infectious diseases. That is not the case today. Now, most people are dying from chronic diseases or accidents. And yeah, I'm pretty sure chronic diseases are the leading cause of death right now. But we also want to look at, we don't just look at across the nation, we also, of course, because we're epidemiologists, we like to study subpopulations, so we may look at who's dying where. So we may break things down geographically. We may break things down by gender. We break things down the same way that we've been talking kind of about stratifying. Remember that word? Is that word coming back to you? So when we break it down into subpopulations, we talk about stratifying. We do the same thing with mortality data. The real question is, where are we getting this data? So majority of mortality data that we get comes from death certificates, right? So nationwide, whenever someone dies, legally, technically, unless they're dying in the middle of nowhere and nobody knows that they've died, a death certificate will be produced. And then all the information from those death certificates goes to the National Center for Health Statistics. Those are the same people that are collecting all that birth certificate information. Now, regular death certificates are different from fetal death certificates. So any fetus that's over, I believe it's 24 weeks, or maybe a week or two off. Any fetus that's over 24 weeks, and then any person after that gets a regular death certificate. Anything that's any fetus that's less than 24 weeks gestation gets a fetal death certificate, and those are reported separately. So that's different numbers. But anyway, when you have your death certificates, you usually have what whoever has filling out the death certificate has determined to be the cause of death, as well as just the general demographic factors that you would expect to see on birth certificates. So the one important thing, we use death certificates a lot to talk about trends in disease. Death certificates are notoriously unreliable, right? So the cause of death is usually not as straightforward as what's on the death certificate. So frequently, cause of death will be myocardial infarction, like their heart stopped, right? That's not really why they died. It was due to the fact that they'd had diabetes for 20 years and had really high blood sugar and like all these other things. So sometimes all of those other comorbid conditions are listed on the death certificate. Sometimes they are not. So basically, the moral of the story, you have to take death certificate data with a grain of salt. So let's see. Other sources of mortality data. We also have autopsy reports for people on whom an autopsy was conducted. Not everyone that dies has an autopsy. Actually, most people that die don't have an autopsy. So those reports are typically not representative. We can also get hospital information on deaths in hospitals, but again, that would not be representative of the larger population. It would just be representative of hospital deaths, usually. So the mortality rate is what we usually talk about when we talk about mortality statistics. Now, when you're talking about mortality rate, you always have to have a specifically defined population. So it could be the mortality rate within the United States, where your denominator would be every single person in the United States, or it could be a specifically designed, so the mortality rate within a particular hospital, or the mortality rate for a particular disease. So if you had mortality rate for flu, the denominator is every person that had the flu. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, that's wrong. Back up. It's not every person that had the flu, it's every person that was at risk for the flu. So, if you wrote that originally thing down, I was wrong. Mortality rate is defined, it's everyone that was at risk in your defined population. Now the other part, because this is a rate, it's a mortality rate, so it has to have some aspect of time, right? Otherwise it would just be a proportion. Rate always has time. So it's the number of deaths occurring in that population during that time period. The number of deaths is your numerator, so you have a count as your numerator, and the number of people in your population is your denominator. So remember last week we talked about crude rates and stratum-specific rates, and we briefly touched on adjusted rates, right? Your crude mortality rate, anytime it says crude, that means that's the actual number that you calculate from the population. You have not broken the population down. You have not made any mathematical adjustments. So it's simply the number of deaths that occurred in that population during that specific time period over the total number of people in that population during that time period. And again, we typically express this as per 1,000 per year. So we have an annual death rate. It's annual, it's obviously per 1 year. Number of deaths from myocardial infarction out of everyone in the United States. That would be our mortality rate. Now let's contrast this with the case fatality rate. The case fatality rate is more specific. So the crude mortality rate is telling you, out of your entire population, how many people died. The case fatality rate, is the number of people who died divided by the number of people who had that disease. So when I said that thing about the flu, I was talking about this actually. So the case fatality for flu would be the number of people that died from flu out of everyone that had the flu. See how that's different? So mortality rate, everyone in the entire population is the denominator. Case fatality rate, everyone who had the disease is the denominator. All right. So we talked last week, we started on the measures of comparison. We kind of briefly glossed over comparing stratum-specific rates and adjusted rates. Why wouldn't we want, so let's say we had the number of people, we had the prevalence of diabetes in Missouri and the prevalence of diabetes in Illinois. Why might we not want to make direct comparisons there? That's a bad example. So let's use this class. And we'll compare it to, and we're looking at the incidence of premenstrual syndrome in this class. And we're comparing it to a class in the women's study department. Why might that not be a fair comparison? If we just say the rate of premenstrual syndrome in here is 15 out of 30, 50%. But in the women's study class, it's 95%. Why is that not a fair comparison? Yeah.
Most likely be more women in the women's studies class.
Yeah, exactly. So if we're using this class as our population, there's a lot of men in this class that I would hope are not getting PMS. I don't know, you may have some sign of them. But it's not a fair comparison because the women's studies class is probably almost exclusively women. So there's going to be a lot more people in there that are reporting PMS because there's more women. So we have to some way level the playing field so that we're comparing apples to apples. We're not comparing apples to oranges. And we do that by either comparing stratum-specific rates or we compare adjusted rates. So What we could do is we could stratify based on gender, right? So we would stratify based on gender, and we would find out, oh my goodness, look, there are so many more women in the women's studies class than there are in this particular class here. Maybe we would just want to compare amongst the women, which would be a fair comparison, right? Now, adjusting, so strata-specific would mean we would stratify men and women, and we would compare the women to the women, and we would compare the men to the men. An adjusted rate, we would mathematically take out the effect of gender. So we'll get to the math behind it later. But we would mathematically take out the effect of gender, and then we would put one number. So we would still compare the EPI class to the women's studies class. We would have one number to do it, but we would have mathematically removed the variability due to gender. We'll talk about how that happens in a second, so don't worry about it. We will, I promise you, we will understand this. But how do we do this? So I am not going to make you guys calculate standardized rates. It's just easier to understand when you see it done. So we're going to watch you, but don't feel like you're going to be tested on calculating standardized rates. Those of you who are finishing or who are going to go on and do your master's degree, be prepared because they're going to make you do that when you get to that point. But I'm not going to make you do it here. So, direct standardization is also called direct adjustment. So when we talk about adjustment, we're always talking about some statistical procedure. We're talking about mathematically manipulating the numbers so that we can level the playing field. So the direct method, we're going to look at, uses a reference population as the basis for comparison. So in this example, we have population A and we have population B. So let's say this is Kansas City and St. Louis. The population of Kansas City and the population of St. Louis. And we are going to standardize based on age. So the age distribution in Kansas City is different than the age distribution in St. Louis. I don't know if this is true, but I'm just, for argument's sake, let's say the age distribution in Kansas City, the people there are a whole lot older than the people in St. Louis. So if we want to compare it based on a disease state that we know is related to age, if we just look at the crude rate of diabetes in Kansas City versus the crude rate of diabetes in St. Louis, we know diabetes is related to age, so more older people have it. If we just look at the crude rate, it's going to look like Kansas City has a much bigger diabetes problem than St. Louis does, just because they have more old people. Now, I'm making all of this stuff up, right? As far as nobody's going to go home and be like, did you know that Kansas City has... No. This is illustrating a point. But so, in order to level the playing field, we are now going to adjust. So we have population A that we're interested in, and we have population B that we're interested in, and now we are going to standardize based on age. So, in order to standardize using the direct method, we're using the age distribution of another population. So let's see. Let's watch. Oops. Okay, that one too. Actually, before we move to the next slide. So we have population A, and we know that we have in this younger group, we have a rate of 43 cases of disease X per person per year. And in the population B, in the younger age group, we have a rate of 47 cases of disease X per person per year. So these are the stratified rates. These two lines are the stratum-specific rates. This bottom line right here, when we're talking about totals, this is the crude rate for population B and the crude rate for population A. So when I was talking about the diabetes thing, it looks like if you just look at the crude rate, if you don't have any information about these top two columns, and we haven't broken it down by age, it looks like population A has a much higher rate of disease than population B, right? If you were just looking at the bottom line and you didn't have any information up here. But we also know, if you look at the numbers, population B is older than population A. And we say, our disease might be related to age, maybe we should look at this closer. So we stratify. And when you stratify, you start to look, I'm sorry, I lied. Population B is younger than population A. I'm not doing well today, am I? I apologize. I've been running around a lot. Anyway, how lost are you guys yet? Should we back up and start over? Yes, no, maybe? No, we're good? We keep going? Okay. Do you speak for the whole class? All right. Excellent. All right. So we know that it looks like population A, according to our crude rates, has more disease than population B. We think our disease might be related to age, so we stratify based on age. We have done that here. When you look at the stratum-specific rates, which is one of the ways we talked about comparing, right? You look at the rate among young people, 43 and 47, those don't look that different. And we look at the rate among older people, and we say, those still kind of look different. Maybe there's something there. Maybe it's not related to age. But we don't know yet. We're going to go ahead and we're going to calculate adjusted rates. Now we will move on to the next slide. In order to do this, and I'm going to read because obviously I keep fumbling over myself, so if I just read what I've written, then I know I will say it correctly. I'm not going to confuse you any more than I have been. Okay. So we have the age distribution. What we can do right here, let's see, and I'm going to leave my place. We're going to use, okay, back up. We're choosing population A as our standard population. All right, so when we're doing direct standardization, we have to pick a population that's going to be our baseline. Here we have decided to use population A. It's kind of arbitrary how you decide to do that. You may have general reasons, but for the sake of argument, it really doesn't matter which population you choose. So long as you choose a population, that is going to be your standard population. What we want to do is calculate the rate of disease in population B, what the rates would look like if the population was distributed the same as population A. So if population A had the same age distribution, if population B had the same age distribution as population A, we want to know would the rate of disease look the same. So in order to do that, I'm killing you guys today, and I apologize. All right. So when we look at this, population A, 37.5% are under 44. Population B, 93.8% are under 44. Right? So we talked about this population B is a lot younger than population A. We want to know what the case rates look like if group B had the same population as population A. So we're going to do that. How do we do that? We don't skip pages is how we do that. The first thing we do is we make population B have the same age distribution as population A. So instead of the real, this is where the mathematics comes in, this is why we're calling it adjustment. Instead of the real distribution, we say, okay, well what if group B had 600 people that were under 44 and 1,000 people that were over 45? So we ignore the fact that in reality this is the number of people that population B has, and we say, okay, we're going to make population B look like population A. We now have to convert based on the rate. So we have the disease rate from population B, right? We calculated at the very beginning. We know that 47 out of 1,000, 47 per 1,000 people per year in the younger age group were sick in population B, and 200 per 1,000 people per year were sick in population B, based on this information right here, right? So we have the stratum-specific rates. So we take the population of population A. Let's say we have the same distribution as population A. We multiply it by the rate of disease, the true rate of disease in population B, to get the expected number of cases we would have if population B looked identical to population A. So when we do that, we now see that population A, nothing changed about population A. We didn't mess with that one at all. We still have the total, the crude for population A is 79 per 1,000 per year. But now that we've adjusted B, we now see that if population B looked exactly like population A with the age distribution, we would expect to see 228 cases per 1,000 people per year. Right? That's a lot more. So we can say now that we have made population B look like population A, we can confidently say that, yeah, population B is probably a lot sicker. Have I completely confused everybody? Don't worry, we will always revisit this. We're going to keep going today, but when you sit on it for a little while, you change your mind, you decide you want to revisit it, let me know and we'll do it again. Because now we're getting to the super fun one, which is indirect standardization. We have to use indirect standardization if we don't actually know the stratum-specific rates of the population that we're trying to standardize. So, let's say we know all the information about population A. But in population B, we just know how many people there are. Oops. But we want to know what the rate of disease would be in population B. We know the total rate of disease in population B, but we don't know the stratum-specific rates. And that's a problem if we were trying to standardize, because if you recall, when we were using direct standardization, we use these stratum-specific rates in order to calculate the expected number of cases, right? So if we don't know that information, we have to figure out something else. So in the indirect method, we essentially calculate backwards. So we use the rate of disease from a reference group. Now the reference group in indirect standardization is not one of these two groups. It is a third hypothetical group. I'm not going to actually show you how to do it because it's way more complex than the other one we just did, and that one was kind of difficult anyway. Point that you need to take home is that the indirect method exists, and that it is possible to standardize rates when you don't know the stratum-specific estimates. And should you wish to actually do that, there are plenty of textbooks that will show you how. If you really want, we can sit down and do it together. But for the purposes of this course, you just need to know that it's possible. Is that good with everyone? Now, the other take-home message is that when you're using the indirect method, you cannot compare disease rates amongst multiple study populations. So, if we were using the direct method of standardization, we could take multiple populations, many, and we could compare them all to each other, because we could all standardize them back to like that one original population. So if we'd had a population C in the direct standard, we could have standardized it to the age distribution of population A. We could have kept going. In indirect, you cannot do that because you're using a third hypothetical population. So you can only make comparisons back to that. So we had population A and population B, and we used indirect standardization to compare them to population X. So we can say population A compared to population X, and we can say population B compared to population X. We cannot say population A compared to population B. So you can only look at the disease in your population compared to the reference population. So you can't get quite as much information in that particular aspect. So that concludes the confusing part of the afternoon. We're going to go back and we're going to talk about all of your the birth certificate stuff. So the way I wanted to do this, so everybody was able to get through. So every group came up with their own case definition, right, of what counted as a teenage birth in, what was it, Hampton, Massachusetts, or something like that. I would like to go through and have each group tell me what your specific case definition was, and so we can make comparisons, and then we're going to talk about the numbers that you guys came up with based on your comparisons, and then we'll talk about the National Center for Health Statistics, and it's technically not the right answer, but it's the answer you would get if you were using the U.S. definition of teenage birth. All right. First things first. Where's my whiteboard? That's not what I want. All right. Which group would like to go first and tell me their case definition? All right. Group number 1. I'm going to find it. All right. What was your group's case definition for teenage births?
Okay, so we just defined it as if the actual birth occurred between the ages of 13 and 19.
Who was 13 and 19? The mom?
Like the mother, yeah.
Nope, and 9. So birth between 13 and 19, and you...
And so 47 out of 51 one, which is, and then that's like out of the ones we give about of the total population is 47 out of 1,673, which is.
So how many live births did you count? I'm sorry.
There were 47 out of the 51 number.
47 teen births.
Yeah.
Okay.
Were you looking for volunteers, I guess?
Yeah.
Our
So
next case definition was a woman between the ages of 13 and 19.
you guys cheated and looked at that other slide that you weren't supposed to get, which you would not have had if you used the PDF version and not the extra one when somebody asked me for the Word document. Sorry. You were supposed to have the slide that had the actual definition on it.
I don't think we
Oh,
saw
no,
it.
no, we didn't use
You
it.
didn't?
No.
I don't think so.
No.
Oh, actually, no, you don't.
No.
Never mind.
Yeah.
I am really
Yeah,
going
I
crazy
looked it
today.
up.
I am so sorry.
Thank you, Dr.
I am so
and can I finish? Thank you. That gave birth.
You're going to have to actually start over again because I got really way distracted. And...
No problem.
Okay.
A woman between the ages of 13 and 19 that gave birth in Springfield, Massachusetts during the year 2001.
In 2001?
Yes, ma'am. And per that definition,
Uh-huh.
there were 38 births
38.
in Springfield, Mass.
All right. Next group. Yes.
Our definition was teenage birth is said to be any female aged 13 to 19. It's the same thing as theirs, except for ours was they had to be a resident of Springfield, Massachusetts.
Resident. Okay, and how many did you have?
38.
38. And there were 5 groups, right? Okay. What was your definition?
Ours was that a teenage mother is a female ranging, or between the ages of 13 to 17.
All right, and how many did you have?
35.
35. And last group.
Ours was any woman between or through the ages of 13 and 19 that gave live birth while residing in Springfield, Massachusetts.
So it was residing in, not delivered in. Which did you count?
Well, we meant delivered.
You meant delivered in.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's,
Well, because there's difference,
that's
right?
what we counted, yeah.
So you counted people that were
Yeah.
delivered in.
Which came out to be 41.
Okay. All right. So please note that depending upon your definition, you get a different answer. Right? Hence the importance of consistent case definitions. So let's say you were working on a research team, and one of you was using this definition up here, and another person was using this definition down here, and you were both in charge of different certificates. You guys would not get the same information, right? You would be counting different things. So, important thing number 1 is consistency of case definition within your study. You need to have a clear, very precise definition of who you actually want to include in your study. The next thing is to make sure that everyone involved in your study understands that case definition and applies it consistently. Now, the larger issue is the fact that across studies, everyone seems to define particular things differently. And it makes comparisons across studies somewhat difficult. And if we had some national clearinghouse of like case definitions, it would be great. But we don't, so you just do what sounds best to you. But, so let's walk through the actual definition, which is live birth to a woman 15 to 19 years old. So according to the National Center for Health Statistics, a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old girl who gives birth does not count as a teenage birth. I do not understand why they chose to define it this way. I'm just telling you, this is how it is defined. The other thing to note about births when they're talking about births in specific counties, it is the residence of the mother, not where the mother delivered, which is why I asked specifically that question. So we would count teen moms who delivered that were 15 and 19 years old, who lived in Springfield, Massachusetts at the time of birth. Doesn't matter what county they delivered in. So people who delivered in Springfield, Mass, but did not live there, do not count in their teen pregnancy statistics. This is all important information if you're trying to determine if Springfield has a teen pregnancy problem. If you notice that, like, everyone from, I don't know, Wilbraham is going to Springfield to, like, deliver all their kids. So Wilbraham has a huge teen pregnancy problem, but they're all delivering in Springfield because that's the closest major medical center, and you would be a little misled about where your problems are, right? So, importance, so my count using this definition, wait, what was my count using this definition? I don't remember. I have my count using 3 other definitions, and I don't have it using this one. Anyway, it's somewhere in between the ones that you guys do. Point of the story, though, you understand the importance of case definitions. Does everybody understand how we write them, why they need to be specific? That's the true lesson of last week. All right. Oh, it's the other hand up. Did I miss that? This is all the stuff that I just said. Yeah. Okay. Less important. The more important thing is that we get started on the stuff that we were going to do today. All right. Any questions about anything that we've covered up to this point before we move on? None? Okay. I always like to talk about things we've done before, so if you decide that you want to ask those questions, you can. Because today we're going to talk about screening and measurement, and I'm going to warn you in advance that measurement is my favorite topic in the universe. Love it. Love every aspect of it. I think it's great. It is super fun, and I can talk about it all day, but I'm not going to. So we'll talk about screening first. Before we can talk about screening, we have to talk about prevention of disease. Now, in general, we have 3 levels of prevention that correspond to different phases in the development of disease, right? So primary prevention, we're talking about preventing somebody from getting the disease. So before they get sick, preventing. Primary prevention, we talk about a lot in the realm of infectious disease, right? So a mode of primary prevention from getting a cold is washing your hands. We talked about lots of primary prevention. Primary means before you get sick. Secondary prevention, on the other hand, and tertiary prevention are talking about things that happen after you get sick. So primary prevention, here's our nice little timeline. Not as pretty as the timelines that some of you guys did the first day, but primary prevention, so you're healthy. We want you to stay healthy. We use primary preventive techniques to do that. You get sick. At this point, you don't know that you're sick. So biologically, something has happened and the onset of disease has occurred. You don't know you're sick. This is when secondary prevention comes in. Secondary means we want to find out that you have the disease and do something to ameliorate the effects of the disease before you realize that you're sick. So that's when screening takes place. So you got sick. We use secondary prevention before you know that you're sick. Then all of a sudden you develop symptoms, and then tertiary prevention is really talking about, we know you're sick, we want to keep you from getting sicker. Yes?
So would secondary prevention be like, so if they found polio, right, they go on and like they vaccinate everybody who might have been exposed, would that be secondary prevention?
Yes, we typically refer to it as screening, but yes, that would be an example of secondary prevention because you know that there was a case and there's a possibility of exposure. So you want to, well, It depends. It would be secondary prevention if the people had already like actually gotten polio and you were trying to make the polio less. It's primary prevention. So if somebody shows up with polio, they may or may not have been exposed to it, they may or may not have it, and vaccinate everybody, that would actually be primary prevention. Technically, if those people actually did have polio but didn't know it, it would be secondary, but that's kind of splitting hairs at that point.
So we couldn't really make that call, like, we wouldn't know.
No, usually the distinction, primary prevention, when you're talking about things with infectious diseases, most of the time you're talking about primary prevention because you're trying to keep people from getting it. Obviously, there's primary prevention efforts for chronic diseases too. Like McDonald's just announced that they're putting all the calorie counts on their, so that's part of a larger public health effort to keep people from being very overweight and obese. I don't know if necessarily it's going to deter people from eating giant Big Macs, but it might. But so there are primary preventive efforts that go on with chronic diseases because we obviously want to prevent those from occurring as well. But a lot of times we're talking about infectious diseases, so preventing someone from getting a cold, preventing them from getting the flu, preventing them from getting smallpox. So all the vaccinations are primary prevention. Secondary prevention, we're really mainly talking about screening to see if you have the disease, because if you have the disease but aren't symptomatic yet, maybe there's something we can do early on to either keep you from developing a full-blown case of it, or to keep you at least from having worse side effects, or possibly cure you, or it becomes bad. Tertiary, you're already sick. So tertiary, you know you have diabetes, but we want to keep you from losing your leg, right? So screening, nice little definition here. The process of using tests on a large scale. So one large scale, right? To identify the presence of disease, and apparently that's supposed to be healthy people. Sorry, there's missing a Y. The important thing to note about screening, we're talking about people who look like they're not sick. So we're trying to identify disease in asymptomatic individuals. That is screening. That is different from diagnosis. So a diagnostic test, you have weird symptoms, we want to see if you actually have the disease we think you have. A screening test, you don't have any symptoms at all, but we want to see if you have the disease. Right? That different makes it? That distinction clear? Yes?
Could you give me an example of a screening test?
So a screening test, so mammography is a screening test. An HIV antibody test, if you don't think that you have it, if you're just going in for routine, that's a screening test. Anything where you're talking about a large scale and you're asymptomatic, you're not going to the doctor's office because you think you're sick. It's just whenever you have a health fair and then they do the blood pressure and cholesterol and all that stuff. Those are all screening tests.
Oh, so getting vitals is a screening?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's
Yes.
diagnostic?
No, not unless you already have some condition and they're checking up on it. But the reason that every time you walk in a doctor's office they check your blood pressure is because they are screening to make sure you don't have hypertension. Because you wouldn't know, right? Hypertension doesn't have any symptoms unless it's really bad. It just slowly eats away at all of your organs and makes them fail later. All right, which leads us to types of screening. So mass screening is sometimes termed population-based screening. We're aiming to screen either the whole population or large portions of the population for a given disease. So blood pressure screening is a great example, right? You walk into a doctor's office, they screen your blood pressure. You walk into a health fair, they do your blood pressure. We really try to do everybody's blood pressure everywhere. That's mass screening. Multiple or multiphasic screening is when you give several screening tests all at once. So when children enter kindergarten, they usually have a hearing test, a vision test, and a bunch of other cognitive tests. They're all given at the same time. Multiphasic or multiple, that just simply means we're piling them on. We're doing all of them at one time. Targeted screening means that you have a specific group of people that you think might be at high risk of disease, so you are targeting your screening. You are only going to screen them. So we know that prostate cancer is much, much, much more common in older men. So when you're 20, you don't get a prostate exam. When you're 60, you do. we screen older men, we target our screening efforts to people that are at high risk of the disease. And then case-finding or opportunistic screening is aimed at patients who are consulting a health practitioner for some other reason. So, for example, moms who go in, who take their newborn in for their first week baby checkup, the pediatrician typically screens the mother for depression. Most of the time they don't know that's what's going on, but there's a standard of care where the pediatrician actually screens, but the woman didn't walk in the pediatrician's office asking to be screened for depression, right? She walked in to say, hey, is my baby okay? But while you're there, we'll go ahead and just take this opportunity to see if you're sick. All right, now, in a perfect world, it sounds like we should just screen for everything, right? Why don't we screen for every disease that we possibly could have a screening exam for?
Because some screenings aren't exactly accurate, they do the false positives and stuff.
Yes, even before you get there. Yes, you're absolutely right. That is one of the reasons that we don't. But yes,
Some people don't want to be screened.
some people don't want to be screened. For sure, yeah,
A lot of money.
because it costs a lot of money. Let's say, for example, well, actually, let's go back. So we'll talk about the criteria and we'll talk about why. You want to screen something that has a serious public health problem. There's really no reason to screen large amounts of people for a disease that they're probably not going to have. So if you have a disease that has a very, very low prevalence, you're really kind of wasting your time and money. Preface this by saying, we are now getting into the fundamental distinction between public health and clinical medicine.
In public health, we are concerned with populations at large, right? So what is best for the population is not necessarily what is best for the individual. But when we're talking about screening programs, we're talking about screening large populations, so we really only want to screen things that are actual public health problems. We want there to be a high prevalence in the population. Again, that's part of being a public health problem. So there are serious public health threats that there may not be a huge prevalence in the population, but they're bad enough to where it's worth looking at. High prevalence in the population is important because it's part of this serious public health threat, but will also, when we start talking about the measurement of disease, makes the predictive accuracy of your test better. There should be reasonably long, recognizable pre-symptomatic stage. Now, why do you okay, first off, what does this mean? Reasonably long, recognizable pre-symptomatic stage.
I mean, if you can't, there's no point screening for it if you can't get it before it really starts getting someone sick. 'Cause
Right,
you don't have any
exactly.
symptoms.
Exactly. So, if the biological onset of disease and the emergence of symptoms happens at the same time, when are you going to screen that? Right? Because screening, by definition, takes place in apparently healthy people. So you want to know that there is a biological onset of disease, and then there's a long period of time where you could identify people that are sick, but they have not started showing symptoms yet. Otherwise, what's the point? There needs to be an effective treatment available. So why would you screen large numbers of the population just to tell them, hey, yeah, you're sick and gonna die? Sorry. Tough. Doesn't make a lot of sense to spend money doing that when it's really not serving any purpose, because it's not going to increase their lifespan, it's not going to increase their quality of life. You don't really want to screen for diseases where there's no effective treatment. Now, that doesn't mean there has to be a cure, but it does mean there should be some benefit to identifying the disease early. Otherwise, you might as well wait for them to get the symptoms because you're not getting any benefit from the early screening. And then treatment can be administered in the pre-symptomatic stage. So same things I said before. It's fine if you recognize that somebody is sick, but if you can't start treating their illness until they actually start showing symptoms, what good is it knowing that you have this disease? So you're just going to sit around every day waiting for your symptoms to start? Now this all pertains to public health screening. So there's things that people will screen for, like Huntington's disease, right? Huntington's disease is a degenerative hereditary disease. If one of your parents have it, you have 50% chance of getting it yourself, and it means that you will die shortly, usually in their 40s, right? We don't do public health screenings for Huntington's disease because they're not huge public health problems, but people that have a parent that has the disease may choose to know, even though there's no treatment available. But that's a clinical medicine decision, not a public health decision, right? And that's more of a diagnostic test anyway. All right. So those are the characteristics of a disease that make it a good candidate for screening. Characteristics of the disease. The second part of that is you need to have characteristics of the test, right? So it's great that this disease would be perfect for screening, but if you don't have an actual screening test that works, there is no point, right? So what makes a screening test a good test? It needs to be reliable. Who wants to guess what reliable means? Who knows what reliable means? Not even guess. Who knows? Now I'm going to make you guess.
It's like, it's not like it's a true like answer, but like it's accurate, like accuracy and all this.
You are so very close. You're right when you say it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Yeah.
Consistent?
Consistent, yes, right? So it doesn't have to be true. It may not be the right answer. We haven't gotten to that part yet. Reliable means that you get the same answer over and over again. Yes.
Isn't there a threshold like 96% or higher? Like in thresholds in clinical medicine, there are rates that if you're within a 4% margin, then that's acceptable.
Yes. So you're getting more to the validity of the test, not the reliability, and those thresholds are variable based on the purpose of your diagnostic or your screening test. And so we're actually going to talk about that in a second. Yeah, so the thresholds are still kind of arbitrary. Somebody sat down and made a decision as to what those thresholds would be, right? But reliability is, sometimes people talk about repeatability or consistency, but it means if I do this screening test today, and I do it a week from now, I will get the same result. Now, barring any changes in your actual health, right? Sensitive and specific. Sensitivity and specificity are ways that we assess validity. Now, validity means, are you getting the true answer? Validity means, are you truly measuring what you think you're measuring? And we use, in epidemiology and for screening tests at least, we use sensitivity and specificity to determine whether or not we truly are measuring what we think we're measuring. We'll talk about these more in a second. Now, the screening test also must be acceptable to the population. So you can have this great test, right? This test that's reliable, you know every single time you're going to get the same answer, and you're pretty confident that you're always getting the right answer, but people just find it abhorrent and will not do it. So that's really a purpose. Not a good test. If it's something that people will not do, if it's not acceptable to the population you're trying. And then finally, it needs to be reasonably inexpensive and safe. So it doesn't matter if you have this fabulous screening instrument, if it costs $1,000 for every single person you administer it to, that's not going to be a very cost-effective or efficient mechanism for determining the health of the population. And you also don't want to expose people, asymptomatic individuals, to a bunch of unnecessary risk when the benefit might not be that great. All right, so let's go back to reliability. Has anybody ever seen this particular, some variation of this diagram before? Nope. If you open any statistics textbook, and most epidemiology textbooks, and any other research methods textbook in the universe actually, you will see something that looks like this, because we're talking about reliability and validity. So remember, we talked about reliability is consistency. You hit the same point every single time. So you can have a test that's reliable but not valid. So here, we keep getting the same answer, but it's the wrong answer. So a test can be reliable but not be valid. Now, a test cannot be valid if it's not reliable. So a valid test, we get the right answer. But it also needs to be reliable because we get the right answer every time. Right? Makes sense? All right. So we assess validity in epidemiology using sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity is the ability of the test to correctly identify all those people who have the disease among everyone that's diseased. So you have a screened population, and a certain number of those people are sick. Does your test identify all those people? The sensitivity of the test is the estimate of how well you're actually identifying the people that should be identified, the people that are truly sick. Specificity, on the other hand, is the ability of the test to identify correctly the people that are not sick. So you have your whole population, and you have a group of people that truly are not sick. How well does your test identify those people as not really being sick? So we'll walk through this. So let's say we have a population of 20 diabetics and 20 non-diabetics. And we're screening them with a blood sugar test. And the blood sugar test goes from low to high. And this is where we start talking about the threshold of tests. But so here we have the test. Your blood sugar can be low, it can be high, or somewhere in between. And we have our diabetics and we have our non-diabetics. And if you look, you see most of the diabetics kind of fall in this high range. And most of the non-diabetics have relatively low blood sugar. But we kind of need to assign some cutoff value, right? We need to say, okay, at some point this test is going to discriminate between the people that have diabetes and the people that do not. We have to say who's going to count as being positive and who's going to count as being negative. What blood sugar level do we need in order to say, yes, this person has diabetes and no, this person does not? If we choose a high, now here's the point. The cutoff values are chosen by the researchers. So there's standards in like clinical medicine or and when we're talking about screening tests, there are standards. But those standards were decided by a person. It's not an absolute. So your blood sugar runs on a continuous scale, right? But at some point we decide there's a cutoff, and if your blood sugar is higher than this, then you have diabetes, and if your blood sugar is lower, then you do not. We do the same thing with blood pressure. We say if your blood pressure is over 120/80, right, then you have hypertension. And if it is under that, then you are fine. Well, 120/80 is relatively arbitrary. There's reasons why they chose that number. But your blood pressure isn't dichotomous, right? But so if we choose a high level for our cutoff value, then we'll identify some people with diabetes, but we will miss a whole lot that do not. This test would have low sensitivity. Because sensitivity means, out of everyone that truly has the disease, how many of those people are identified? It's a proportion of people identified as having the disease by the test out of everybody that truly has the disease. So we know all these people have diabetes on this left-hand column, but if we use our threshold level here, we only find 5 of them. So this test does a very poor job of identifying people that have diabetes if we use this high cutoff level. Now on the other hand, it does an excellent job of identifying the people that don't have diabetes. So the specificity is high. So in this case, when you do the math, the sensitivity is 25%, the specificity is 90%. Now, we could decide to use a low cutoff point. So when we do this, when we use the low cutoff point, we get most of the people with diabetes, right? So our sensitivity increases. We get a high sensitivity. Here we have a sensitivity of 85%. We identified 85% of the people that had diabetes. Now, but when we do that, when we lower our threshold really low, we now are also saying a bunch of these people, a bunch of the non-diabetics, have diabetes according to our test. So we have low specificity, because remember, specificity is correctly identifying the people that do not have the disease out of everyone that does not have the disease, that truly does not have the disease. So we trade off, yes?
Is there an industry standard for sensitivity we should?
Preferably, we try to use tests. Yes, what?
Well,
Answer?
wouldn't the standard also depend on the consequence of having a false positive
yes.
or a false negative?
Yes, it does. So there's 2 parts to those answers. A, we like our sensitivity and specificity. We try to get them both above 90%. That does not always happen. Frequently does not happen. but it is highly dependent on the purpose of using the test. So here we have a test, we have high sensitivity, but low specificity. And we're going to come back around to this concept of the purpose of the test in just a second, I think. Not I think, I know. I wrote the lecture. All right. So in the real world, right, we haven't been able to truly box those people. So in the real world, we don't even have the like cross-hatching designation. In the real world, we just have dots. And so we are somehow trying to identify the appropriate level of blood sugar in this example to be able to categorize the people that have diabetes and then categorize the people that do not have diabetes. So we use a gold standard measure. Right? We have a gold standard that we have decided actually truly is the answer, and we compare our screening test to this gold standard. Now, in the real world, where we don't really have any information, a screening test with a high cutoff will treat anyone down here as normal. So we have our screening test. We don't really know the real answer. We have our screening test. Anybody that tests below this level is going to be considered to not have diabetes. And anyone that's above the threshold we will consider to have diabetes, and we will look at them. So if we use the high cut point here, we end up with identifying 7 people as having diabetes. Now some of those people truly do have it, some of them don't, based on our screening test. And if we use this low threshold, I think we have like 31 subjects that we have said have diabetes. The important point to remember is that this is a threshold that is set by the person that is coming with the screening test. And then it's your decision as the investigator or the developer of the screening test to determine what the appropriate threshold is. Because we're taking something that's measured on a continuous scale, and we are now chopping it in half, placing people in categories, putting them in boxes, and then using those boxes to make other decisions. So, there's a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, obviously, and the cut point determines how many people we say have the disease. Now, when we're talking about screening tests, it's important to remember that a screening test is kind of our first line of defense, right? We are not diagnosing people with disease based on a screening test. These are people that are asymptomatic, and we are saying, hey, wait a minute, you got a funny lab result, we need you to come in for more testing. That's very different from saying, hey, you had this test, oh my gosh, you have this disease. Those are not the same thing. And in a screening test is never used to actually absolutely say, yes, you have this disease. A screening test is a screener. It's an in the door. It's like, okay, we think there might be a problem, let's go for further testing. And that's when you start going for the diagnostic testing. Now we use sensitivity and specificity to analyze both screening tests and diagnostic tests, but they're different. The goals of a screening test and the goals of a diagnostic test are different. And so what you want the sensitivity and specificity of a test to be is different depending on if you're looking for screening or you're looking for diagnosis. If you want to make sure that you catch all the people that are sick, or if you want to make sure that you exclude all the people that aren't sick. So, when you have a test, and remember that we're talking about diagnostic tests here because screening tests, by definition, we don't want to be expensive. But if you have a diagnostic test that's expensive or invasive, you want to minimize the false positives. Or if you have a screening test, which, because that wouldn't necessarily be expensive or invasive because that wouldn't meet the criteria of a good screening test, right? But you want to minimize the false positives. But if the penalty for missing a case is high, you want to maximize the true positives, and it's okay if you end up accidentally catching some people that don't really have it. So, for example, if we're trying to minimize the number, or if the penalty for missing a case, so gestational diabetes is a very big problem, right? Not catching gestational diabetes can be hugely problematic for both the mother and the baby. So I think at I can't remember, 27 weeks or something like that, every woman that's pregnant goes in and does a screening test for gestational diabetes. And they make you drink this god-awful liquid and then sit there for 3 hours and they take your blood. They use that as a screening test, and they set the threshold for blood sugar change very low for this test, because they want to capture every single person that possibly could have gestational diabetes. So, if you don't pass the screening test, then you go back and they make you do a whole bunch of other fasting, crazy stuff. But the reason they set the threshold so low is because if you miss people that actually do have gestational diabetes, it could cause big problems for both the mom and the baby. So the penalty is very high if you miss those people. Now, I'm trying to think of an example where it's more important to minimize the false positives. Because in that case, in the gestational diabetes case, you're going to get a lot of people that don't actually have gestational diabetes that fail that first screening test, right? Because you set the threshold really low. And I'm completely blanking on, let's see, did I put an example in here? Oh, false positives. So you want to minimize false positives for really stigmatizing illnesses, right? So if you have a disease that is socially stigmatizing, or is going to cause somebody's insurance rates to go up, to skyrocket, you really don't want to accidentally label a lot of people as having that disease, if they really don't. So that's an instance where you really want to make sure that you're minimizing the number of false positives, the number of people that have the disease, that test positive but don't have the disease. So how do we calculate all of this? So we have some gold standard. We have some way of saying, yes, in the perfect world, we know that, yes, you do have this disease, and in the world, we know that you do not have this disease. Now, granted, the gold standard is really just our best way of measuring. The gold standard is never going to be truly perfect, but it's as close to being perfect as we have. And then we have our new screening test. Anyone want to guess why we would bother to create a new test if there's a gold standard?
To check the gold standard?
Well, we can't check the gold standard with the screening test because we don't know the properties of the screening test. We don't know if it's a good test. Great guess, though. Anyone else?
I mean, what if the screening test is cheaper and faster than using the gold standard?
Exactly. So you've developed this new, your gold standard costs $1,000 a person and it takes 10 days to do. And your screening test takes 2 minutes and costs 50 cents a person, right? It's probably a good idea to see if this screening test is a relatively good measure, right? So we're always trying to improve upon what we have before. So we have the gold standard, but typically, if the gold standard was cheap and efficient, you wouldn't be looking for a new test. You're right. But if the gold standard is not, which typically it isn't, we're trying to find a better way to do it, or a faster way. So, when we're trying to determine validity, when we want to calculate sensitivity and specificity, we have our gold standard, so we know the true number of people that have the disease and the true number of people that do not have the disease. And then we have our screening test. We give our screening test to everybody in our sample, and we know the people that tested positive from that screening test, and we know the people that tested negative from that screening test. We put all this information into a 2x2 table. This is a 2x2 table, 2 by 2, 2 rows, 2 columns, right? Get to know and love it because epidemiologists put everything in 2x2 tables, and we will revisit it frequently throughout the semester. But so we can break this up, and we have the people that truly have the disease based on the gold standard and that tested positive. These are our true positives. They truly have the disease and they tested positive with our screening test. Then we have the people that truly have the disease based on the gold standard but tested negative. Our screening test did not pick them up. We have the people that truly do not have the disease but that tested positive. These are the false positives. Sorry, these were the false negatives. And then we have the people that truly do not have the disease and that tested negatives, the true negatives. Right? Does that make sense? And using that, we can calculate sensitivity, which literally is the proportion of people that tested positive that truly have the disease out of everyone that truly has the disease. That is sensitivity. So, A over A plus C, if you set up your table this way, these are the true positives, so it's the number of true positives divided by everybody that's diseased. So the number of true positives plus true negatives. False negatives, sorry. And specificity, remember specificity is the proportion of people that test negative given that they truly do not have the disease. So, We have the people that are the true negatives, cell D, divided by everyone that's truly negative, according to the gold standard, E plus D. So, ideally we want to maximize sensitivity and specificity, but they are a trade-off. The more sensitive test, the less specific it's going to be, right? Remember our little threshold diagram thing? You have to kind of do a little balancing act to figure out which is more important. So you want your test to be both highly sensitive and specific, but you cannot make that a perfect trade-off. If a test is not sensitive, you'll end up with a large number of false negatives. So given that screening tests are designed to identify asymptomatic individuals as having disease, you don't want a screening test with low sensitivity. It's a bad idea. It's a worthless test. Because the whole point is to identify people, right? So for most screening tests, you want them to be highly sensitive at the expense of some specificity. You're okay with that? Because if the test is not specific, you'll get a lot of false positives. But in a screening test, that's usually okay, because they're going to go on for further testing, and then you'll figure out that they don't have the disease. Now, false positives aren't a great thing. Obviously, you don't want to tell somebody, so for mammograms, for example, you don't want to be like, oh yeah, we saw something, you might have cancer. That causes a lot of emotional stress, right? So they may not actually have cancer, because mammograms are a screening test. But they're designed to pick up every little thing. So mammograms are usually highly sensitive at the expense of some specificity. And it's just kind of taken that people are okay with the emotional turmoil. Alright, which leads us to predictive value. Sensitivity and specificity are characteristics of the test. Positive predictive value and negative predictive value are characteristics of the test and of the population. So the positive predictive value, it's measuring the probability that given that you have a positive test, what's the probability that you actually are sick? So that's different from sensitivity. Remember, sensitivity, we're talking about given that you have the disease, what's the probability that the test is picking you up? That the test is identifying it. Positive predictive value, we're saying, okay, given that we know you have a positive test, how likely is it that you actually have the disease? And negative predictive value is essentially the opposite. Given that we know you had a negative test, how likely is it that you do not have the disease? Epidemiologists usually speak in terms of positive and negative predictive value, of sensitivity and specificity. Clinical medicine usually deals in the realm of positive predictive value and negative predictive value, right? So if you go into your doctor and you have a diagnostic test, and your test comes back positive, your doctor wants to know how likely it is that you really are sick, right? Positive and negative predictive value are influenced by the prevalence of the disease in the population. And we will walk through that. So, positive predictive value, I'll say it again, it's telling you that if you have a positive test, are you correct in really assuming that you have the disease? It's dependent upon the prevalence of the disease in the population. So, the higher the prevalence in the population, the higher your predictive value will be, assuming you have a sensitive test. So why is this important? Because assuming that you have, if you're screening a population for rare disease, so rare disease has low prevalence, right? That all makes sense. I lost my place. A test with high sensitivity and high specificity will yield more false positives than it will true positives. Now, whether or not that's a problem, something to be. But you want your which is why you want to apply your screening program in populations with a high prevalence. Now, we're going to walk through an example where we actually calculate positive and negative predictive value, changing the prevalence of the disease, and I think it's going to make a little bit more sense when we do that. So, let's see. I have my nice little whiteboard here. All right. So let's say we have a population of 100,000 men. I haven't practiced with this in a while. Alright, so we have a population of 100,000 men. We are going to screen for prostate cancer. And so I'm going to put together a 2x2 table. I am not doing well with this little thing. So we have people that test positive with the gold standard and people that are negative with the gold standard. So remember, the gold standard is what we are considering to be reality. Alright, and then we have the people that test positive. Why did that happen? I don't know what that happened. And then we have the people that test negative. Alright, so let's say we have 800 people that tested positive that are truly positive. So that are true positives, right? And we have 3,200 that test, ow! Just go home and just like cover my head in my blanket and not come out until tomorrow or something, I don't know. We have 3,200 that tested positive but that don't have the disease. We have 100 that truly have the disease but tested negative, and we have, let's see, 95,900 that don't have the disease that tested negative. So those are the true negatives, right? First off, what is the prevalence of prostate cancer in this population? You have the information to determine this. Who remembers what prevalence is? How do we calculate prevalence? Anyone? What's the numerator in prevalence? So if I asked you to calculate the prevalence of prostate cancer in your population, what's the numerator going to be?
800.
Sorry?
800?
Well, very close. It's 900, because prevalence, we want to know the true rate of disease, right? And so we know, based on our gold standard, that 900 people have the disease. So 900 is our numerator. What is our denominator?
100,000.
Out of 100,000, because we have 100,000 people in our population, right? So our prevalence here is 900 out of 100,000. So our prevalence is 0.9%. 0.9% of our population has prostate cancer. Does everyone understand why it's 0.9%? Are you getting that? Yes? We're good? Alright. Who remembers how we calculate sensitivity? Let's calculate the sensitivity of this test. Remember, sensitivity is the proportion of people that have the disease that tested positive divided by everyone that has the disease. So what is sensitivity? 800 divided by 900. Yes. So our sensitivity for this test, 800 divided by 900. So our sensitivity is 0.89, or we can say 89%. Either one's fine. So, it's okay. Our specificity, how do we calculate specificity? What is specificity? Sorry?
How many people like tested positive for it, basically?
That's sensitivity. So specificity is the number of true negatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the number of people that don't have the disease, that tested negative, divided by everybody that's truly negative. Because specificity is talking about if you do not have the disease, what's the probability that you're going to test negative? So our specificity is, where am I? 9,900 divided by, what is it? 9,900, yeah. And and so that is 0.97. So that's pretty specific. So we have a sensitivity of 0.89 and a specificity of 0.97. Now, positive predictive value. Sensitivity and specificity were going up and down in the columns. Positive predictive value, we're talking about features of the test. So we have the number of true positives out of everyone that tested positive. Right? So it's given that we know you tested positive, how likely is it that you have the disease? So we have the number of true positives divided by everyone that tested positive. So we're going in rows. So our positive predictive value is 800 divided by 4,000. Oops. And that's 0.2. So if you have a positive test, there's a 20% chance that you actually have the disease. If you have a positive test, there's a 20% chance you have prostate cancer. Now, this was for a pretty low prevalence condition. Alright, so let's look at it again. How do I erase? There we go. So this time, we still have our so we have our gold standard, positive and negative. And our test, screen positive and screen negative. Alright. And this time we have 1,600, 200, 95254, 2946. What is the prevalence of prostate cancer in this population? Remember, how do we calculate prevalence? So we still have 100,000 people. We still have a population. So we're talking about the prevalence. So we're talking about the number of people that are sick in our population out of our whole population. So we have 1,800 divided by 100,000. So our prevalence here, and we're talking about this population, 1,800 is 1.8%. So the prevalence in our population before, we still have 100,000 men that we've tested. And we're testing them using the same test that we did before. The prevalence has changed. We have more people that are sick in this population that we're testing now. What's the sensitivity here? How do we calculate sensitivity?
1,600 over 1,800.
1,600 over 1,800, which is? You've all got computers in front of you. What is it?
0.89.
0.89, right? We're using the same test we did last time. Remember, sensitivity and specificity are properties of the test. So they're not going to change. So our sensitivity is still 0.89. Any idea what our specificity is? Anyone want to guess? Calculate it? Let's go. Unless you can't read my writing, in which case that might be the problem. So how do we calculate specificity? So 95,254 divided by
98. 2,000.
whatever these two numbers added together is. Yeah. And we get a specificity of 0.97, which is exactly what we got before, right? Because our test hasn't changed. We're using the same test. It has the same sensitivity and the same specificity. The only thing that has changed is the prevalence in the population. So, why don't we calculate the positive predictive value of this test? We have a higher prevalence. Remember, positive predictive value, the number of people that truly have the disease that test positive, divided by everyone that tests positive. So our positive predicted value is 1,600 divided by 4546, I think. No, it's 4546, yeah. And so our positive predicted value is now 0.35. Does anybody remember what it was before? 0.2. So just by applying the same exact test in a population that has a higher prevalence of disease, now if you have a positive test, you're 35% likely to actually have the disease. Right? So this is important that you want to apply your screening tests in populations that have a higher prevalence of disease, because then you know when people test positive, they're actually more likely to have the disease. Which kind of seems like a good thing, right? All right. Let's take 5 minutes, since everybody is completely brain dead. I finally got my groove, and going, and everybody's just kind of zombieing out on me. So, let's take 5 minutes. We will come back, and of course we're going to break into groups again, but I really want you guys to switch it up. You need to be in different groups now. You should have at least 2 or 3 different people than you worked with the past couple weeks. But take 5 minutes, come back.